So I want to welcome people back, and I want to tell you how pleased we are that you're here. Um, as we move into our second session, I just want to call your attention to several upcoming CPH events. First, our Humanities in Action series is going to continue this coming Wednesday at Flyleaf Books. And it will feature Professor Mark McNeely from the Keenan Flagler Business School here, where we are now located. And he will be discussing the democratization of artificial intelligence. He's an expert on the impact of artificial intelligence, and that will be on Wednesday at 4:30 p.m. At Flyleaf Books. I also want to note two upcoming weekend seminars. On Saturday, November 18th, Professor Emeritus Tim Carter will present a distinguished scholar seminar on the history of opera in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And I think this will be a very interesting overview of people like Monteverdi, Mozart, and Verdi. And then on December 2nd, we have another dialogue seminar on the links between civic life and public health with the UNC historian Ana Campo and a professor of public health, Laura Villa Torres. They will be talking about the connections between civic health and physical health, healthcare, in both Latin America and Latinx communities in the United States. So that's on December the 2nd. And finally, as part of my continuing thank you for all of the people who support the work of Carolina Public Humanities, I would like to acknowledge and thank a couple of members of our advisory board who are with us today. I'd like to ask them to raise their hands. Let's see, I wrote down, I noted their names. Sam Jackson is here. And what about Miriam Zetlow? She's here. Okay, thank you. It takes a village to sustain Carolina Public Humanities, and these people are all helping us build an ever-expanding CPH village. And I just wanted to mention one other thing about the humanities. This really startled me. This week, the Board of Governors announced that they're going to support the continuing creation of some distinguished professorships at UNC with matching funds from state money. But these professorships will only be given in STEM-related subjects: science, technology, engineering, or mathematics. So I, as a lonely humanist with a few friends, I just want to point this out because subjects outside of this category can keep a distinguished professorship if it already exists, but a new one will not be created. So I won't say it's exactly like the end of bathing in the Roman Empire, but can you imagine a world without new distinguished professors in the humanities? I just want to point that out as my way of saying that if you would like to support the humanities, you don't have to start a distinguished professorship, but Carolina Public Humanities is one of the places where history, literature, philosophy, religion, art are always going to be discussed. So thank you to those of you who support us, and there is a little card in your packet if you'd like to join in with those who support us. There's also an evaluation form in your packet, so I'll just mention that to you if you could fill that out before you leave today. So now I'm pleased to introduce our second speaker for this seminar, Professor Jennifer Gates Foster, who is an associate professor of classical archaeology and is connected with both the UNC Department of Classics and the curriculum in archaeology. She completed her BA degree in anthropology and archaeology at the University of Virginia, and then went on to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor for graduate studies in Greek and classical archaeology. She received her PhD at Michigan in 2005 and then held the Moses and Mary Finley Research Fellowship at Darwin College at the University of Cambridge for a couple of years before moving on from there to the Department of Classics at the University of Texas. where she taught between 2007, 2000, and 2013. She came to UNC in 2013. So Jen, as her friends call her, Jen's research and teaching focus especially on Egypt in the Hellenistic and Roman eras. And she's published numerous articles, book chapters, and a recent book on the archaeology and ancient history of this geographical region. She's also interested, like Henry, in the history of pottery and material objects and what those objects tell us about the cultures in which they were produced and retained. And she particularly focuses on Egypt rather than Iberia. Jen is also a very successful teacher, and I should note that in 2017, she received the Tanner Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. And she is a leader of the Catawba Vale Collaborative Project in Western North Carolina. I just want to shout out to this. She doesn't have to go to Egypt to make a difference. She's developing a trail network that is linked with the history of that region in our state. Archaeology helps us understand North Carolina as well as other parts of the world. So we're very pleased to welcome her back to Carolina Public Humanities for this session on continuity and change in the Eastern Roman Empire during late antiquity. Her last presentation came the week before COVID hit, and she gave a wonderful presentation. Her co-presenter fell ill, in fact. We didn't know what had happened, but she rose to the occasion and became the speaker for both parts of a dialogue, and the following week the whole world shut down, and the last thing we knew was the Roman Empire was having problems. So we pick up where we left off 4 years ago, and it may not have been the fall of the Roman Empire, but we did see a drop-off in public activity. Welcome back to Jen Gates Foster. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Lloyd. No, right? Yeah, no, but it is really true. Yes, I know. I did have a little bit of PTSD when Lloyd wrote me to give this talk. Are you?
Turn that on.
It's on. Yeah, I can hear that it's on. Yes, because it literally was, the week before COVID, and I thought, it was Vin Stephanitis. It's just got a bad cold. Little did we know. So it's nice to be back. It's a real pleasure to be back with you, and it's an especial pleasure to have been asked to be here with Henry, who's my new colleague. Really excited he's here to have another young scholar working on Roman imperial history. Late antiquity is such an exciting and important part of our field. So we feel like we really landed a great hire for this position, and I was on that committee and just so happy to be able to be here with him. So I'm really glad to have been asked to do this. It gives us a chance to talk and to sort of hear from each other. So it's a pleasure for that reason too, and to see all of you again. So I'm going to start with what Lloyd has already sort of alluded to, which is the reason this topic I think was raised as a possibility for a dialogue seminar, because it really, I want to, in a lot of ways, want to kind of foreground the approach that I'm taking, sort of draw out some of these themes in advance so that we can, I hope we'll return to some of this in the Q&A and in the dialogue after the break. But I think the reason that Henry and I were asked to talk about this particular topic, it isn't just because it's something we think about as scholars. This is Henry's particular sort of focus and expertise, a little bit less so mine, but it gives us a chance to kind of reflect on the anxiety that Lloyd has alluded to, that's so much on the minds of public intellectuals, is sort of in the discourse. And these are just headlines from the last 2 months, right? And I could have found many more. The no, really, are we Rome is my favorite. I think that's the favorite. That's from The Atlantic. So there's this anxiety, right, and around dysfunction, around the economy, social and economic devolution, loss of hegemony, leadership. There are all these different sort of silos of anxieties that are out and kind of in our discourse as a society right now. This kind of loss of coherence, right? What makes sense? Where's the strain? How do we hold on to the narrative of what's what's going on in the US today. There are disagreements about institution, about what symbols matter, what power should look like, and the elevation of differences that have always existed. They've been part of the fabric of the US, but they take on new significance when broader narratives of belonging and shared deference seem to be fading, right? And these are some of what's generating a lot of this, are we Rome? How often are we thinking about Rome? How often do men think about Rome? This is the most recent sort of Twitter X thing. How often do the men in your lives think about Rome? Has anybody seen this? Yeah. It is hilarious, is it not? I love it. So apparently all the time, every day, they do. So that sort of reflection, this kind of preoccupation with processing those anxieties through the lens of Rome, or the Roman imperial experience, I thought it might be worthwhile to say a little bit about these comparisons up front as a way of framing my discussion of the transformations and changes that characterize the Eastern Roman Empire between 300 and 600, roughly the same period that Henry was talking to you about. Some of the strains that, and I did make myself sit down and read some of these. I often have to tell you assiduously avoid these Are We Rome podcasts because they make me crazy. I usually have to pull the car over and sort of bang my head on the steering wheel. But I did sit down and read them, and in the hopes of kind of pulling some strands out that then I could use to talk about today. And these are some of the themes that I sort of found in these, is that the decline is gradual. It's unrealized until it's too late. The experience of decline is deceptively incremental. Significance is only visible in hindsight. We don't know it's happening until it's happened. And it seems like a lot of the writers who write about this idea, their goal is to create a sense of immediate crisis, of awareness, of sort of tectonic shifts that are happening under our feet. They're disguised by our normalization of daily events and a desire to take comfort in these sort of superficial continuities that don't really mean anything. The essential qualities of American life are somehow shifting. So these are rhetorical techniques, reflecting genuine anxieties and perspectives that are often sort of, these writers take on a kind of Cassandra, role of the person speaking truth, whose foresight is doomed to be ignored until the moment when we look back and realize that that was the moment that bathing stopped, right? So I would argue that these narratives of decline and collapse are always rhetorical in a way. One man's collapse is another man's political liberation, or woman's political liberation or transformation, or put any other verb in there that puts a different spin on profound political or economic change. So we, as a part of our collective historical project, we assign values when we create narratives about the past, right? And Lloyd has already alluded to that, and that's something we can talk about in the discussion. So coming up with this idea of decline, or the notion of a collapse or fall, is a way of processing the complexities of an unknowable and unrecoverable past, right? The past is past, even though William Faulkner disagrees with that. The past is past. We're what we have to work with are our own strains of data, our own perspectives. So to kind of bring that into perspective, sort of moving into antiquity, I wanted to illustrate some of what I mean about that before I get to the late Roman material by illustrating some of this with another example of the subjectivity of the notion of collapse. I'm referring to another great and wrenching transformation that happened in antiquity, and that was the conquest by an ambitious barbarian from Macedon, a man named Alexander the Great, who conquered the entirety of the Eastern Mediterranean and all of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, bringing it under his rule for a brief and ephemeral moment of time, all the way to the Indus Valley and into the Mediterranean. So he broke and transformed the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia by conquering and adapting the free city-states of Greece and the Achaemenid Persian Empire to his own purposes in the late 4th century BC. So through processes of colonization, the imposition of new economic and political structures, he and his successors remade the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asian worlds. But we never talk about this as a period of decline. There's no fall, right? There's no end of something wonderful and ideal, right? It is, though, a period of profound transformation, and a violent one at that, much like the Roman imperial project was as well. Now, in antiquity, there were people who viewed this very differently. And just a quote here from a man called Demosthenes from his first Philippic. when he's exhorting the Athenians to take action against Philip, because nothing less than their civilization is at stake. What we as a people are, the destiny of Greece, is at stake if we don't act against this barbarian from the north, who's going to remake the world that we live in. So even though we have people from voices from antiquity telling us that this was viewed at the time as a profound and transformative moment of transition, we don't talk about it that way. We talk about it instead by emphasizing the continuity between Alexander, the Macedonian, and what came before. His adoption and adaptation of the Greek language, his spreading of Greek pottery and other types of material practices, including bathing, all over the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia, creates a notion of the spread of a kind of continuous Hellenic culture. So history has decided that this was no fall, this was no rupture, but a kind of expansive continuity from the late classical era of Hellenicity into new regions. But viewed from a purely political perspective, it was indeed a rupture. And from certain facets of cultural practice, it was also a profound rupture that came both with political transformations and material and linguistic transformations. So it's worth kind of carrying this in our minds, I think, a little bit to, as we think about the late Roman Empire, of a fall that wasn't one and a decline that isn't one in your textbooks and in our popular discourse, when we consider the question of what it means to discuss the decline, fall, transformation of the later Roman Empire, and also to the transformations of our own political and cultural moment. So with that, back to the late Roman Empire. Okay, so Henry did a wonderful job of not burdening you with political discourse or sort of talking about that kind of bird's eye top-down political narrative. He really gave you a ground-up perspective on the western half of the Roman Empire. And ironically, given that I'm a field archaeologist, I'm going to stay a little bit more at that higher remove and talk to you about what the political changes are that actually happen in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the reason that I'm doing that is because there is a kind of continuity that is profoundly different in the Eastern Mediterranean, certainly politically, than there is in the West. And I will also address materiality and the way that daily life does or doesn't change. But I'm going to do that in the context of really thinking about the political transformations and the different stages of political transformation that happened from around 300 really through the early 7th century, so right around the time of the expansion of the Islamic polities in the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll start by sort of taking us through some of the transformations that are happening, giving a kind of historical overview of the main political and territorial developments in the Eastern Mediterranean, so between 300 and the early 7th century, and talk with you a little bit about how that narrative looks very different from what's going on in the Western Mediterranean and when the divergences happen, right? When is the point at which what's happening in the East looks really different from what's happening in the Western Mediterranean? How are they connected? Are they connected at all? And then we'll talk about social and cultural changes that accompany those political transformations, right? So politics and then kind of life underneath that. What are the kinds of institutional changes that are going on? And then I'll draw some examples from 2 regions where I have worked as an archaeologist over the last 25 years. One in Syria, Palestine. I'll talk to you about a site that I've excavated in northern Israel, modern Israel, where we have precisely this period and a very well documented sort of set of deposits and materialities just describe what some of those changes look like and how they help us illustrate what's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. And then lastly, I'll turn to Egypt, which, as Lloyd said, is my primary excavation focus and the place where I've done most of my archaeological fieldwork since the 1990s. So we'll consider how those 2 regions as examples of the Eastern imperial sphere, how they help us understand some of those changes and continuities that are happening in this late antique or Byzantine period. And Byzantine is a term that's used to apply to the Eastern Empire. Okay, so that's our roadmap. So some history, some discussion of social changes, and then some examples from Israel and from Egypt. All right, so some dates. So like Henry did, I'll give you this sort of a caveat of, yes, I'm going to show you lots of maps, lots of dates. We're going to talk about some of these. Each of the dates that I've chosen to put on this sort of key slide are important for different reasons. They each represent different kind of political moments in the history of the Eastern Empire, and we're going to work our way through this timeline, talking about what's going on, what are the political and territorial changes, and then what are the kinds of institutional and cultural shifts that seem to accompany each of these different stages in the history of the Eastern Roman Empire. So that slide is there just as a kind of roadmap to take us through time. All right, I'm going to start a little earlier than Henry did because I think we need the past as prelude for understanding what's going on in the early Byzantine, late antique period. And that is thinking about late antiquity, the sort of political structures that existed in the late Roman Empire, right? So in the 3rd century BC, the Roman Empire was in a state of complete chaos. It's called the 3rd century crisis. That's a kind of common term for the 3rd century, because there is a period when we have many emperors, upwards of 40 in a period of 30, 35 years, right? So these are emperors who are making competing claims with each other. There are simultaneous claims being made. You have an emperor who manages to get the title. He reigns for 3 months before somebody assassinates him. It's a period of complete political chaos across the empire. So it's a very turbulent period. At the end of the 3rd century, so in the last quarter of the 3rd century, we have a sort of solution that emerges from that chaos. And that solution is partition. And the reason I talk about this is because it forecasts the solutions that result in the division of the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire, which is not just an economic division, but is an actual political solution to an unmanageably scaled empire in its later antique periods. So that idea of division is a political solution that's arrived at in the late 3rd century after this period of chaos, when we have so many competing imperial claimants to the throne, a period of active civil war that's 2 generations long. It's unbelievable in a way that the empire existed through that, right? The idea of the project didn't come apart entirely. So this multi-generational series of conflicts. At the end of the 3rd century, a man named Diocletian, whose name you've probably heard before, comes up with this idea of refounding the Roman Empire. And that's a theme that you've already heard from Henry. Justinian does this. Theodosius, in a way, does this too. Come up with this idea of remaking. And they do. They make an expedient and open declaration of a revisioning of the empire as a state. And this is really profound and I think probably most clearly articulated for the first time under Diocletian. Diocletian comes up with this solution of creating multiple simultaneous rulers. And that's antithetical to what the empire had really been up to that point. We have some experimentation with it in the 3rd century in that chaotic period, but up to that point, the notion of a divided empire was antithetical to the Roman imperial project. But under Diocletian, he comes up with this idea of dividing it into essentially sections and making it into a more manageable, simultaneously co-ruled entity. So what he does is he divides the empire into 4 parts. He himself takes one section, and then he appoints another ruler who he gives 2 names that were Augusti. So instead of a single ruler, a single emperor, you have 2. And then you have 2 junior emperors who also rule parts of the empire in the west and in the east, right? So this is the tetrarchy. So 4 rulers, and that's so visually articulated in a lot of material culture from this period. A lot of royal iconography, imperial iconography shows the 4 emperors sort of embracing one another in this visual expression of the notion of harmonious co-rule. And this is from St. Mark's in Venice, if any of you have seen it there. It's very famous, made of purple porphyry from Egypt. So this division into 4 sections, he also simultaneously founds a new capital in the eastern half of the Roman Empire at the site of Byzantium. And Byzantium is it the center button? No, it's not. Top. Oh, there it is. Okay. Yeah. So Byzantium is here. That is an older Greek city. It's a colony, a Greek colony that existed for many centuries. But during this period it's declared a new Eastern capital to go along with this division into four sections. And this is Diocletian's sort of portfolio, if you will. So Byzantium becomes this important new site of the capital. And it's given the name Nova Roma, New Rome. And it is meant to operate as a kind of pendant second capital, with Rome as the primary capital in the West. But there are sub-capitals in each of the four divisions of the tetrarchic state. So this idea of dividing the empire in order to effectively rule it sort of breaks something and breaks things in a productive sense, because it now becomes possible to imagine the Roman Empire as something that is governed by multiple individuals sharing power and has this territorial division kind of baked into the project. And it isn't always the case that the empire will be divided from this point on, but it does mean that this is now an option when we think about ruling, and our emperors who are coming to power have this as a way to think about their, oops. Well, let's see if it's going to advance for me. Looks like it's not.
Ram can make it advance.
Yeah, let's see. Let's see if it's, I don't know if I hit something on this that changed it, but it shouldn't. Yeah, it's not. Yeah. Really strange. Let's try the, there we go. All right, there we go. All right, we're going to go to, close that out, and then we're going to reopen it, and everything's going to work, right? All right, there it is. Okay, I think that did it. Yep, that did it. Okay, good, we're set. All right, so where was I in the tetrarchy? All right, so the so this idea of division becomes an important piece of how solutions can be found in this later Roman period, and it also has the effect of expanding Roman presence in a lot of these zones. And Henry has been talking to you about the Western Empire, which I'm going to more or less ignore until we go back into our conversation about kind of comparing these two. But very importantly, it divides East and West. And this becomes sort of a way, a kind of de facto way of thinking about solutions to the problem of organizational control, of stability, right? This notion between an Eastern and Western half in the empire. Part of the necessity of this expansion of the notion of administrative divisions is that we also get an increasing emphasis on provincial bureaucracy in the period of this period in the late 3rd century. And so there's an expansion of people who can hold important roles and help administer these new provincial divisions and these new sort of imperial divisions. So that's another piece of it. And each of the emperors who is assigned one of these portfolios also is assigned a certain number of members of the army. It increases the size of the army in the late 3rd century. So the bureaucracy, the army become bigger. We see more of a footprint in these various divisions of those institutions, which, you know, as Henry has described, are such key parts of the Roman project. There were some of the reasons why elites and locals have that kind of direct contact with an imperial administration are through institutions like the army and the bureaucracy. And those really intensify in terms of their presence, really starting in this late 3rd century moment. So those are sort of two things that I want to pull out of the tetrarchy. So division is a solution, and the imposition institutionally of larger numbers of individuals who are empowered out in these distant provinces to administer the functioning of these new sub-states. Now, in the period after the division into the tetrarchy, in the 3rd century, in the 4th century, which follows, in the eastern half of the empire, we see significant conflict, which is engendered by this solution, right? Sort of ironically, this is a solution that works for the tetrarchs, but it doesn't produce the sort of long-term stability that Diocletian was hoping for. In the period after the death of Diocletian and the retirement of some of his co-rulers, there is a contest for control of the empire. The guy who comes out on top is a guy called Constantine the Great. The reign of Constantine starts around 306, lasts about 30 years, and Constantine reunifies this empire temporarily under his rule, and eventually founds the city of Constantinople, gives it his name around 330. So under Constantine, there is this ambition to pull all of the empire back together, to reunite those two halves, but critically, under that newly reimagined empire that's reunified under Constantine, the city of Constantinople, with its eastern capital, previously Byzantium, becomes the location that has priority over Rome at this point. And this is something that Henry didn't mention. We can talk more about that. But the de-emphasis of Rome as an imperial seat is a feature of the 4th century. It becomes another one of these subsidiary capitals. It still has a lot of cachet. It's still the heart of the imagined empire, but Constantinople by this period has become the center of administration. And that is an important piece of the picture for thinking about the Eastern Empire. All right, so in that period, after Constantine's rule, after the fall of the Tetrarchy, we have a series of rulers who are sort of in contest with one another. There is increasing doctrinal disputes and changes, which are a feature of the 4th century. And under a ruler called Theodosius I, which Henry also mentioned, we see that there's an interest in creating a more stable state, right? So the 4th century has continued to be very unstable. There's a lot of political influence that is tied up with doctrinal disputes in the church, which is becoming more and more powerful through the course of the 4th century. So Theodosius I, he is tasked with settling issues in the Western Empire. That's essentially how he comes to power. A man called Gratian, who is a ruler who succeeds him who succeeds Valentinian in the West, is having to deal with the Visigoths, these Gothic incursions, and also with the frontier that Henry talked to you about. So Theodosius I is appointed by Gratian, who's ruling in the West, to sort of make a settlement with the Visigoths, to come up with a political solution to some of the instabilities in that area. Now, Theodosius I reorganizes the Eastern Empire and takes over the eastern half of the Roman Empire at this time. And he eventually reunites both halves after the death of several Western emperors in 394. So this is overlapping a little bit with some of the narrative that Henry shared with you. And he is the last ruler to reign over a united Roman Empire. And he does that for about 5 months before he dies in 395. So this is the division of the empire, which happens formally under Theodosius. And this is the moment at which we can say sort of formally the fate of the Eastern Empire departs from its Western colleagues. Under Theodosius, there's this very brief moment of intersection, and then that ends, and then we have a fully separate Eastern Roman Empire that exists at that time, and that's in the late 4th century. Okay, I hope all that's cool. All right, so trends in the 3rd and 4th century. How are things changing while all of this political machinations are going on, which I've just compacted down into a very short and quick narrative? How is the state changing, and how are trends in the 3rd and 4th centuries going to help us understand the nature of what's going on in the Eastern Empire? So in the 3rd and 4th centuries, I've already mentioned that in the Eastern Roman Empire, and to a certain extent in the West, we see the expansion of administration and bureaucracy. So a much larger number of officials and local elites who are brought into the imperial project. Power sharing becomes more of an order of the day. The presence of the army in the West is particularly important because of the instabilities along those frontiers that Henry mentioned. In the East, however, along the Parthian frontier, we also have a big investment in the army, sort of increasing numbers of soldiers who were recruited from local peoples. So we see an increasing emphasis on the role of people from the provinces in both the halves of the Eastern and Western Empire, but particularly in the Eastern Empire. These provincials, people who are residents of these territories, become really critical administrators who are participating in the future and the nature of the state during this time. And we also see increasing incorporation of local groups who used to oppose Rome into this imperial project. And this is something that happens in the West that Henry has already outlined for you. Now, along with this expansion of the footprint of the state in the East, it's also true that imperial authority still remains problematic and fragile because of the way that the emperor's projects are in many ways short-term. We see just a few rulers with the kind of control that Theodosius has, that Constantine has, that Diocletian and the Tetrarchs have. So there are still fragilities which are built into the imperial system in the East, and that's something that's a trend through the 3rd and the 4th centuries. And overall, the economy is also plagued by inflation, there's currency devaluation and debasement, and kind of pervasive religious crises persist. And those initially take the form of contestation between pagans and Christians in both halves of the empire. By the 4th century, it becomes more about doctrinal disputes, which are related to the nature of Christ, the Monophysites, for example, and those are ongoing disputes between different sects of Christianity, particularly in the Eastern Empire. So that's a kind of overall picture of what's going on in that period. Now, in the 6th century, sort of taking us into the sort of the last phase of the development of the Eastern Empire, the main ruler that we want to consider is Justinian, who was a ruler in the early 6th century. And Henry has mentioned too, the way that Justinian thought of himself as remaking and refounding the Roman Empire, just like Diocletian and some of his successors, this idea of the remaking and the reconnecting with that imperial model, looking back to Augustus, looking back to the earlier emperors of the 1st and 2nd centuries. And he really considered himself the emperor of all of Rome, including those territories occupied by the Goths, which had theoretically been lost to the imperial project. Interestingly, he spoke Latin, not Greek, which was the lingua franca of the Eastern Empire, and he undertook a series of reforms to try to reconnect himself and his empire with that imperial project. Codified Roman law in 528. He looked to create a kind of unified administrative structure. He built the Church of really emphasized Constantinople as a Christian and imperial city. And so he has a series of campaigns in the West, which Henry described, which bankrupted the empire, essentially. So he sort of, in this idea of making Rome great again, as Lloyd mentioned, he essentially depletes the ability of the empire to hold together as a unified unit. So, and this is just, again, a map to show you the way that Justinian's projects were ambitious, but ultimately unsuccessful. So the other thing about this map that I think is very useful is, while it does show you the extent of Justinian's ambitions, it also shows you the limits of the empire at this time. So we saw that earlier map, and I'll just jump back to that, of the Western and Eastern Roman Empire. And the Eastern Roman Empire, under some of these rulers, under Constantine, under Justinian and Theodosius, includes all of modern Turkey, parts of Greece and the Balkans. It spans Syria, Palestine, and into North Africa, and divides somewhere along the border of modern Egypt and Libya, sort of just generally, if we're thinking about that division into different provinces. So in that, in this period of reorganization and sort of ambition to reunite the empire, ultimately he does that very briefly, but then those borders go back, and over time the Eastern Roman Empire becomes a much smaller project, sort of after the 5th century, continues to shrink for reasons that are related to the imposition of new power, which is coming out of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. And just for context on what happens to the Eastern Roman Empire, which becomes this Byzantine Empire, eventually it is impacted by the spread of Islam, right? These Islamic expansions, which are a feature of the 7th century. And these are coming out of the Arabian Peninsula and really eating away eastern edge of the Byzantine Empire. So on this map, the lighter pink is the empire in 1020, so taking us into the period of the Crusades and just before. But by 1360, only the dark red parts are the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire, which is arguably a continuous entity, which is connected directly back to our late Roman emperors, falls in 1453 to the Ottomans. So there is a direct line between our late Roman emperors, people like Diocletian, and the state under Justinian, Theodosius, and these later emperors who really style themselves as Roman emperors. They use the titulature of the empire, they use Latin, they use it as a liturgical language, while at the same time increasingly sort of orienting themselves to the eastern half of the former Roman Empire. All right, so that big political series of benchmarks in our mind, the division, the consolidation of an Eastern entity. I want to now turn to some of the material which is related to my own excavations and my own research in the eastern half of the empire, to just talk about what these kinds of changes look like from the perspective of the ground up, right? So the larger political picture of division, of continuity, of political connection over time, of changing dynamics. How does that actually affect what we find on sites and places where people are living during precise periods? So my view on that is going to be less comprehensive in a lot of ways than Henry's, because Henry has control of data across the whole of the Iberian Peninsula. But what I'll be presenting to you, rather than a kind of holistic view, dots on a map, is looking at some specific trends that come out of a single site, right? So looking at what does it look like to excavate a village, a town, a temple, a church in the periods that I've just talked about. So how do we see changing dynamics? What does the economy of these places look like? How do we see and find some of the dynamics in these local communities? How much is that big political narrative really impacting what we see happening on the ground? So the first site that I'll talk to you about is the site of Omrit. And Omrit is a settlement in the northern part of Israel. It's near Tel Dan. If any of you have been to northern Israel, near the site of Banyas, which is just at the top of, I'm just going to use this and not touch that because I'm going to break it again. Just at the top of the divisions, and these are the divisions of the diocese in 400 in this region. So we're looking at Syria, Palestine, so the state essentially of modern Israel, with the modern border of Lebanon right in this area here. So the site of Omrit is located just in the area here, right at the edge of what's called Palestina Secunda. So here's Caesarea or Banyas, and so our site is located somewhere, probably in Phoenicia, the ancient division of the Diocese of Phoenicia. So Omrit is a site that I worked at for about 7 years. We ran an excavation, it was a UNC-led excavation of this small tell site. And this small tell site, it's a village, has its earliest phases in the Hellenistic period, so 2nd century BC or slightly earlier than that. But it's occupied from the Hellenistic period all the way through the Crusader period, and actually has remains of a Palestinian village and cemetery, which exists at the edge of the site. And this is a drone photograph which shows some of the excavations in process. This is in 2018. So you can see this is the modern road leading up to the top of the tell, and that part of the tell is the site, the part where we focus most of our excavation. The site, of course, is much larger. It sort of spans all of this hilltop and goes down into the valley. And I think you can actually see on this image of they're actually the Palestinian village that was abandoned during the creation of the State of Israel. That's here. And the ancient site is concentrated here. So this site has a long history. It goes back to the Hellenistic period, all the way through the Crusader and into the early modern period. And it was located in a very important position in Syria, Palestine. And this zone is part of the Eastern Roman Empire from its earliest history, initially part of the Ptolemaic, later Seleucid empires, and then becomes part of the Roman Empire and continues to be part of that really throughout its history. So it's located along a road, very important road, which runs from Tyre, which is an ancient Phoenician city, to the city of Damascus inland. So there was a road connecting Tyre to Damascus. Banyas is here. Our site is right next to Banyas. So it was literally sitting at the edge of this major roadway, which was also used by the Crusaders in their sieges of Damascus, which is why we have so much Crusader material. So this is located in a very important communication route. It was well connected to the city of Tyre, which means that it had access to those ports. And as a result, it's really embedded in the economy and social and cultural sort of dynamics of the Eastern Empire, right? So it's really in this wealth, even though it's slightly inland, it's a fairly modest village site. It does have this connectivity that makes it an important laboratory for thinking about how that Eastern imperial setting is going to result in different kinds of practices of consumption, just like Henry is looking at how much pottery of certain kinds is arriving. How are people living? How do their life ways help us understand their connections to a broader Roman imperial project in the East? So the site of Omrit is, if you've ever heard of it, and you probably haven't, we don't have a National Geographic article, but it is the site of a major Roman temple. So this is a 2nd century CE temple, which is Corinthian in style. This is a reconstruction, a very good one. You see the podium here and the foundation of that important temple. That was one of the largest Roman-style temples built in Palestine in the Roman period. It's associated with Augustus, most likely. It's probably a temple to the imperial cult of Augustus. So that's shorthand for saying that this site, this little village site out in this rural area near Banyas, had a very important Roman profile. If we're thinking about Roman imperial practices and a package of Roman material culture in physical form, I think that qualifies as a part of a Roman imperial package. It is a very sort of canonically typical Corinthian style temple of the 2nd century. Its plan, its decoration, very much like what we see being built in parts of the central Mediterranean during this time. So the material culture of this site in the 2nd century, as we excavate it, as we study the area immediately around this temple, shows us all sorts of connectivity to the Roman material culture package that Henry was describing in the Western Empire. And that really is a koine, or a sort of a kind of common set of cultural practices which are empire-wide in that high imperial period in the 1st and 2nd centuries. So that involves architecture that is linked to the kinds of practices that we see in Italy, and that's certainly what we have here. On a more mundane level, it means terra sigillata and other kinds of consumption goods, things that would be used to set the table, to create foodways, to perform a kind of Roman identity that definitely is linked to empire-wide notions of Roman performance and status. So Omrit, in its early days, is really participating in that. And it's clearly a center of Roman cult, of pagan cult, of imperial cult, in fact. So it really centers Omrit as a participant in this broader dialogue about what it means to be Roman in the High Empire. So it's an interesting case study then to think about what we see at Omrit in its later history. So how does it change in the phases of later Roman, in the later Roman Empire? So late Roman Omrit is a very dynamic place. The site is the largest, it's at its largest extent in the late Roman period, from the 4th century through the early 7th century, when we first see the arrival of Islamic control in that area. The site itself, as I showed you just a moment ago, is of course dominated by that temple platform, but to the north in this area, and this was the focus of most of our excavations, there was an extensive network of houses. There was a stoa, a long colonnaded street, and various other types of buildings, which really outfitted the site of Omrit with infrastructure that was very specifically for this later Roman phase. So it's a big dynamic settlement. Most of what we see in this period is domestic. This temple has gone out of use by that time as a pagan temple. It collapsed sometime in the 3rd century and was repurposed as a Christian chapel. And we find lots of evidence that people at this site were in practice by the 4th century. So looking at the change in imperial culture that characterizes late Roman Rite, we see some things that indicate to us the kinds of economic changes which are part of the Byzantine profile in the Eastern Empire. So what we see at Rite, to kind of offer a parallel with the sorts of things that Henry was showing you happening off in Spain in contemporary times, we see Rite and the residents of Rite participating in a very dynamic and stable set of dining practices, and that's mostly showing up in the pottery, that are characteristic of the Eastern Empire as a whole. So whereas Henry sees the kind of falling away of the consumption of red toned ceramics or fine wares, we see that as a continuous practice throughout the Byzantine era, so through the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. Most of our ceramics, however, really interestingly, are not African red slip. So that ARS that was sort of the prestige ceramic of the Western Empire is quite rare. At Rite, it is quite rare in Egypt. It's quite rare in general in the Eastern Empire. Instead, what we have are types of pottery which are produced in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, and on Cyprus, and in Egypt. So the Koine of ceramics, while there is a kind of interest in prestige dining, we don't, in the eastern half of the empire, see the same sorts of trade networks supplying our elites or our villages in the Eastern Empire. And Rite is a great example of that. So our late Roman fine wares that show up are Phocaian, so coming from Asia Minor, or they're Cypriot, or sometimes Egyptian. We get Egyptian fine wares as well. We also see economic connections at Rite, which point directly to Constantinople. Our coins, most of them for this period, are minted in Constantinople, including a large hoard of gold coins, which were uncirculated. They must have been minted the year before they were lost at Rite in the 6th century. And we also have Sinopian or Pontic amphora. That's our most common type of amphora site. If it isn't a local amphora, if it's imported, it's coming from the Black Sea. So that is a direct connection with Constantinople. So the big picture here is one of connectivity that is ongoing. We don't have that kind of collapse or sort of devolution of the trade networks which would have supported elite consumption of these types of goods. So through the 7th century, right up until the arrival of the Islamic armies, we still have people consuming these types of goods, doing so in ways that show a direct connection with Constantinople and with the provinces of the late Roman Empire to the north. So there's this sort of regionalism. Now, alongside all of that imported, that pottery which is coming from elsewhere, from Cyprus, from the Black Sea, we also see, though, a strong interest in the consumption of local material as well. And that's a big difference between our earlier periods and these later periods at Rite, is that there's a regionalism, which is very characteristic of this period. We have some imports. Those imports continue to be robust. They're still an important part of how people consume and dine. But alongside that is a developing and really strong reliance on local production of ceramics. And those ceramics are fine wares too. So we get sort of fancier things that are being made locally. We get lots of amphora, which are being made locally. So there is, at the same time that the Eastern Empire maintains this kind of long distance connection, maintains a way of being elite, being Roman, if that's what that means. At the same time, there is this regionalism, which is a very strong signature in all of these late Roman sites in the Eastern Empire. So that's a very, I think, quite a big difference between what we see going on in the West, is this continuity of consumption, this continuity of social performance, but also to this strong regionalism of local industries and those kinds of changes. Now in Egypt, which is another kind of case study that we can think with and use to ask and consider, what are the sorts of changes that are happening in the empire in the East, we can think about Egypt as being in some ways very different from what we see going on at Rite, which is in Syria, Palestine. In Egypt, in Byzantine Egypt, Latin was never well established. It was always Greek that is going to be the main language. And Greek continues to be the main language of government and scholarship and administration throughout the Byzantine period, through the late antique period. In the periods of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, one of the profound changes that emerges in Egypt is a disconnection from the Western Mediterranean. African red slip, even though it's being made next door in Tunisia, almost never appears in Egypt. There's only a market in Egypt for those Eastern Mediterranean ceramics. We only see things that are actually produced in Egypt being used in Egypt. It's really rare to have those imports coming from the Western Empire. So there is this division, that political division seems to be mirrored in Egypt and in Syria-Palestine with local economic divisions, right? So the empire, the break between the eastern and western halves of the empire produces a really robust economic milieu that shows durability and continuity, even through all of the instabilities that we see politically in the eastern half of the empire. So these economic links in Egypt are very clearly separated from the Western supply networks. The economic orientation in Byzantine Egypt shifts to the east. We see a lot of robust trade between Egypt and the Red Sea and Saudi Arabia and part of Syria, Palestine, but not with the West. We rarely see that. In Egypt, too, the Greek system of local governance that was imposed in the Hellenistic period and continues in the Roman period changes. So we see a reorganization of landowning. We see a renaming of those offices, which reflects a sort of internal reorganization that's the feature of the Eastern Empire. But Alexandria, the second city of the empire, continues to be a center of religious learning and controversy. We get lots of riots and contestation between pagans and Christians during this time. And the Coptic Church, which is the Church of Egypt in the Byzantine period, becomes increasingly separate from Constantinople. Even though it remains an important economic engine for the Byzantine Empire, Egypt is exporting a lot of grain to the Byzantines during this time. So the picture from Egypt is one, again, of strong regionalism, connections across the Eastern Empire that are probably facilitated by that sort of through line of administrative continuity from late Rome into the Byzantine period, but strong regionalism and an internal dynamic which is increasingly independent over time. And that this is something that we see as a strong feature both of Omrit and Syria-Palestine and of Egypt during this period. So thinking about East and West, thinking about these two periods as sort of diverging from one another in this profound political sense, but also too in the economic and political structures and the structures of daily life, it's important to think about how to compare with one another, right? So just trying to bring some of that together. So the trajectory of the late antique and Byzantine East and West is one of division, right? They diverge sharply from each other starting in the 4th century. And even though the figure of the emperor, people like Justinian, Theodosius, they retain this significant symbolic and actual power, especially due to the relationship between Byzantine religious hierarchy and political authority. Even though that's still true, the nature of that power changes, right? The sort of devolution of that power, the nature of the administration is changing, and we see much more agency given to the provincial centers in the eastern half of the Mediterranean. So overall, the regional trend is toward, even though it's still a unified political system in some way, is toward these regionalized economies and much more delimited spheres of communication and practice. So communities start to become defined in a more regionally driven way, even though the nature of the empire still would argue for some level of continuity and unification. And overall, too, the ties to the Western Mediterranean become lessened over time, and the overall orientation of the economy looks to the east, right? So connections to the eastern half of the empire are really important. All right, so circling back to some of the broader conclusions that I hope that we can draw from this, is we want to really connect the narrative of decline with a narrative of growth and change, right? And that's sort of this overview, I hope, of the Eastern Empire, which is very different in so many ways from the West, helps us to think about how continuity, which is a feature of the Eastern Roman Empire, sort of the things that were different, the retention of things that are Roman is really a deliberate political strategy and an actual feature of daily life. So this was a long and extended sort of transformative process. And the end result is that it looks so very different from the Western Empire, but nevertheless, we still have this strong sense of connection in both to the idea of a Roman past. You know, the Byzantine Empire of Justinian is in practice very different from what existed under Diocletian or under Augustus, but there's this strong connection to the notion of an inherited Roman past, an inherited Roman tradition. So those two things, I think, hopefully help us think about the way that the two halves of the empire, while they have these very divergent traditions and these very divergent paths, also have represent for us sort of two ways that that Roman past continued to be made meaningful. And that emerges in certain ways for Henry only under Charlemagne, but for in the Eastern Empire, that whole section, that whole period of transformation and change is one that's directly relevant to that Roman past. Okay. All right. Yep.
Thank you. And we can come back to why the collapse of Rome is foretelling the decline of the U.S. empire, but let's open. Are there any questions or comments from the I have one already on Zoom. I'll come back to Zoom, but
sure.
Let's go over here.
How excited are you about the recent announcements of the satellite findings of Roman forts throughout the Middle East?
Yeah, so I'm not at all surprised. I knew about those already. And I say that only because we use that kind of data often already. The new things that have just shown up are the things that are on the Mesopotamian Parthian frontier. And that was classified for a long time because of the war. So it doesn't surprise me at all, because we had, there's a guy called Poidebard in the first part of the 20th century, is a French scholar, who published a series of aerial photographs and that identified a lot of these same things. But there's the fact that we now have the satellite imagery that shows that Parthian frontier with such great detail is wonderful. But it's completely typical of the kinds of drylands areas where we get these really strong signatures. And in the work that I do in Egypt, we regularly use that spatial data to work on our fortifications, but it's wonderful. They are, yeah, and that's in many cases in the Jordanian zones, the Trajanic frontier. We have older satellite data, which is our only evidence for some of those fortifications, which have also been destroyed. So there will be now I hope, some considerable work to go back and look systematically at some of the now destroyed fortifications. And most of those, frankly, that have just been released in that data imagery are inaccessible anyway, because they lie in Kurdish disputed territory and parts of eastern Syria. These are really unstable zones. So, but it's wonderful.
Okay, we have a question over here. It comes to
Great presentations.
Thank you.
There are just two questions. What is the greatest contribution Italy has made to humankind?
Italy?
Italy. And second question, what were three reasons for Italy, for the decline of Italy?
Okay, well, I might have to punt to Henry on some of this because I'm not a Western specialist. So I'll tell you what my thought about the Italian. So the displacement of Italy as a center in this period, I assume that's what you're asking about, because Italy kind of comes in and out at different points in the medieval and Renaissance period. So if you mean in the period that I know about, what happens to Italy? Some of it is relevant to what Henry described in the shifting connectivity and networks of the Western Empire, the emphasis on some of the provincial centers that happens after the division of the empire that I described, the Tetrarchy, the rise of Trier, and some provincial capitals, which become important centers of administration and important religious centers in their own right. So those, both on a practical and, so both practically in the terms of the bureaucracy, but also in terms of the prestige of Rome, of Italy, and of Rome as the center of the empire, it by necessity de-emphasizes that, right? When you have the administration of a region that's happening in a provincial capital, Rome retains this prestige because of its history, because of the, the connection with the early phases of the empire, the sort of great phases of the High Empire. But that is a kind of heritage status, right? It isn't a functional administrative status. The center of power is no longer located there in the same way. And so there's a shift towards these provincial capitals. Constantinople certainly supplants Rome as the center of imperial administration. And then when the permanent division of the empire happens and the Western Empire falls, then Constantinople, by design and very self-consciously, becomes the new Nova Roma, New Rome. And much of the kind of prestige monuments are actually exported to Constantinople. So of the kind of greatest hits of the Eastern Empire and of Rome itself are put on ships and taken to Constantinople to be displayed in the circus there and in other locations. So there's a remaking of the idea of empire, and decentering it out of Italy is a conscious decision that's made by some of these Eastern Roman emperors. And they do so in service to this new project, right, which is an empire that wants to directly connect itself to the heritage of the earlier empire, and is making that argument both administratively through titulature and physically in the construction of the new city.
So I was very struck by your image also of the spread of Islam all across the Eastern Empire. And that would also link it up with what happened in Iberia. So what's so striking is these two centers of the Roman Empire both became central components of the Islamic world by the 8th century.
Correct.
And
yes.
Italy, to come back to Italy, remains the one major sphere there that is not incorporated into the Islamic world.
It never is. Yes, that's
so
right.
that's really interesting. I think that's something people are stressing a lot more. Here's a question that says, is there a discernible sequence in which the aspects of imperial domination are seen to decline?
In the East.
First, military; second, political; third, economic; fourth, cultural. In other words, is the cultural influence the last to go, or is the political or economic influence the last to go?
I would say it's the political and economic influence that is the last to go. I mean, the thing with, something that's fundamentally different, and I'm going to go back to this map, about the Eastern Empire is the scale and the way that it changes over a period of some 700 years, right? We're not talking about 120 years or 200 years, which is essentially, give or take, more or less what Henry is describing, is what happens in the 4th century and for 200 years after that. And then we just stop talking about it as anything to do with what came before. And he demonstrated that really persuasively. But in this half of the empire, it is the Roman Empire falls, according to the Byzantines, in 1453. That's when the Roman Empire falls. Up until that point, there is a Roman emperor on the throne in Constantinople. So, so in some respects, that, whether it's performative, theoretical, fictional, or not, the Roman Empire doesn't fall until that moment. If you believe that the through line is true, and they certainly wanted us to believe that, they talked about themselves in that way. So that political piece hangs on until the last. And I would say that the cultural piece actually is quite flexible. And I think that has to do, and this goes back to, a question that Henry was asked about what do these material changes actually signify? What do they mean? What does it mean to eat from a late Roman in LR3C, which is a Cypriot bowl, in northern Palestine, right? What does it mean to eat that way, to consume that way, to live in a house that has, sort of features that might look at least superficially similar to those found in Italy and so on? And so those cultural features are actually really quite ephemeral. We do see the use of kind of empire-wide preferences for red wares. That's related to dining practices, and that's pretty durable at Omrit, really right up until the 7th century, when we start to see some changes happening. But it doesn't happen overnight. The profile of dining, like what you would set on your dining room table in Omrit in the 7th century, doesn't look radically different from what was there in the 6th century. But the site is under Islamic control by that time. And so the really profound changes materially in these zones, in Egypt too, don't happen until the 10th century. That's when things really look different. So there's a period of like 200 to 300 years after the Islamic conquest where people continue to dine, eat, do things that look very similar to the Byzantine era.
So are there similar villas, public baths? I mean, it's all part of the empire, but what Henry was talking about, you don't find in the same way. Is that right?
You don't. So in the reason, and I'm sorry, I've just jumped back to my picture, which I included very deliberately to just like make clear, like they're in on the Roman thing in northern Palestine. And they are, just like to the north in Syria, Baalbek, and a lot of these really like the mega temples of the Roman world are all in this region. So they are all in on being Roman, whatever that means, in this period of the 1st and 2nd centuries. That 3rd century destabilization changes that formula really profoundly. So when Rome's power as an administrator, as a concept, kind of comes back online in the 4th century, it's different. It's just really different. And it isn't just Christianity that makes it different. It's that the notion of power is expressed, I think, quite differently. So Roman power becomes like a soft power. It's not the imposition of things, because this is a power statement, right? To build this kind of temple in the landscape of northern Israel, right near Tyre. And this is taking an Italian concept and jamming it into that landscape. And obviously people supported it, and it was a popular cult spot and so on. But what it means to participate in a Roman project from the 3rd century on in these areas looks quite different. And it doesn't involve these kind of big architectural statements in the same way. It involves a kind of local consumption network that is supplied in some vectors by these kind of long distance trade relationships that are nurtured by the imperial structures that are still in place. There is this sort of strong performance of a Roman identity that's so visible right up until the dynamics that Henry allayed. There are baths and things like that, but they are not common, and they are certainly not comprehensive. So the eastern half of the empire really strongly retains its, a lot of what already, because it was already urbanized. It was
you wouldn't see graphs of like objects disappearing, like
you would see it would change, but I don't think it wouldn't
not
go
the
off a cliff.
complete collapse of that, what we might even call.
And that's kind of the leitmotif here, is continuity is really true. The transformations require these very long views. Right? We're talking about 500 years before you really see something really dramatic happening. That's very different from what Henry.
There's a lot more continuity. He really showed a dramatic
and we don't see
transition
that in the East.
We've seen the terms barbarian and pagan used. I'm wondering if those are translations from the Latin, and were they pejorative at the time? And if so, is that really a appropriate translation today to refer to those people?
To barbarians, like, I'm sorry, did I use the term barbarian? I'm sure if I did. So the right. Yeah, barbarians. Do you see my little scare quotes? Yeah. So it's an ancient term. So it is. And it comes from the Greek, baroi, and it was coined in the 5th century in Athens in some of our Athenian writers. And it is used to refer to any person who doesn't speak Greek. And in the initial use of the term, it's very clear. They don't speak Greek. They sound like this: barbarians. That's where it comes from. That's there's your money has been well spent today. So it is an ancient term, and it was not used pejoratively in the same way that we do. It has become a shorthand for a whole series of ancient sort of ways of thinking about people who are non-Italian or non-Greek. But those ways of talking about foreign peoples, ways of categorizing them, of sort of creating stereotypes that then are useful for contrasting with, Roman identity versus Greek identity, Athenian identity. That's a phenomenon that starts in the 5th century and continues through the periods we're talking about. So the notion of the Western barbarian, the Gaul is kind of the kind of stereotypical barbarian. Caesar really leans into this in his narratives around the wars. So these are ancient terms. They're very complicated in the sense that they're not exclusively pejorative at all. We see them used just simply to describe people as not belonging to a Roman way of life, or in the Greek context, being non-Athenian. A barbarian is a Persian, a Scythian, an Amazon. It can be used in all kinds of different connections. So our connotation of it being an insult, right? Something that you wouldn't, calling someone a barbarian is not a compliment. Isn't true necessarily. It can be in the past, but it's not always used in a negative sense. It's to describe somebody who is not Greek or Italian, for example.
So we have one more question in the room, and then we're going to move into more of a discussion with the panel. Let me come around. Did you have your hand up, Sam? Let me give.
So what made someone a Roman? Is it usually self-declared? I would assume some of these emperors were from non-Italian ethnic groups.
The later Roman emperors in the East, yeah, none of them are Italian. None of them. Yeah. Yes, more or less. No, but there are citizen, it changes in the 3rd century, because there is an opening up of Roman citizenship as an edict by a guy called Caracalla, who is interested in getting as many citizens on board as he can. And so he issues an edict making the legal status of Roman citizenship much more achievable across the empire as a whole. So by this period, by the late antique period, the notion of Roman identity is, yes, tied to ideas about citizenship, but that is changing, administratively changing by the period of the 4th century. And it goes on to change because it becomes tied to your citizenship in a city, because in the East, there are the cities, these municipia, that later in these already long established, old cities that predate Roman involvement by millennia. So they have citizenship requirements and statuses, which Roman citizenship then overlays, right? And so by the later period, all of those things are sort of mixed together in ways that change over time. But there is an investment in the notion of Roman identity. The contours of that are very different from the West, because Latin is never used widely. Greek is the language of the Eastern Roman Empire. It's the language of administration. It's the language of the army in most instances. So Latin is very rare in Egypt, for example. The percentage of papyri that we have, and we have hundreds of thousands of papyri from these periods, less than 1% are in Latin. And it's usually only the army that uses Latin. And it's usually only soldiers from the West who use Latin. Everybody else is speaking and using Greek. And so the use of Latin is a different, it's not a marker of Roman identity or status as well. So the package of what makes you Roman is really different from what we see out in the Western Empire. And that's true throughout the imperial period.
Well, thank you very much. When you started, thank you. I got a new appreciation for the meaning of barbarian. It reminded me when I was in high school, one of our favorite songs was Bar 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 Barbaran. Bar 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 Barbaran. I thought you were going to be a beach. Does anybody remember that song? Yeah, see, it's a certain generational barbarian that we bring together here. Barbaran. Anyway, thank you, Jen. That was excellent. And